So for this part of the cancer discussion, treatment and what do you say? Politics? Something about politics. Fight against cancer, promise and politics. Craig Thompson is going to lead this and moderate this discussion. Craig is a real expert in the field. He's been doing it much of his life. I would say certainly all his career in science, and he did much of that science at UPenn, which was repeatedly discussed earlier in the last session as a place, a center, probably started under him. He went to Penn as to head up the research in the Abramson Cancer Center, and that was sort of born under him, and then he went on to become head of the center. And then he moved to Memorial Sloan-Kettering, so now he's the boss of everything, in probably the largest effort in cancer in the United States, or certainly one of them, but it's certainly in the Northeast, and terrific. But his approach in studying cancer is not the usual one. He's really focused on metabolism, and which is very critical and critically different in cancer cells. But today, we're going to discuss this, the overall field, and see where it's going, and it is very exciting at this time. So, Craig, I'm going to ask you to take over, and watch your time, because you're going to be cutting into lunch.
Well, thank you very much, Roy, and it's a pleasure to be here for all of us today and follow up on the terrific panels we've had this morning. I'm joined up here by three panelists that represent the broader industry, from the pharma community, the regulatory community, and the caregivers community, to discuss some of the issues we've heard about in cancer. To my immediate left is David Epstein, who's just, as of July, became the former CEO of Novartis Pharmaceuticals, but under his leadership, and his leadership before that in Novartis Oncology and Molecular Diagnostics, they were really responsible for much of the molecular revolution that you've been hearing about in the molecular understandings of cancer and some of the targeted therapies in the cancer area. David is now the head of Remedy, a consulting firm in healthcare, so if any of you want to partake of his services afterwards, he's here. To his left is Margaret Peggy Hamburg. I think she needs no real introduction to this audience. She's the former commissioner of the FDA and served for the capacity of the majority of the time in the Obama administration in that capacity. She's currently the foreign secretary for the National Academy of Medicine, where she's focusing on health issues of global impact. Clearly, cancer is one of those, and serves as a liaison to other national health organizations. And so Peggy brings her extraordinary experience in the regulatory community and in global health to this panel. And finally, on the final end of the panel is Cliff Hudis. He's a renowned breast cancer physician. He has recently taken on the task to become the CEO of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, ASCO. That professional body represents 40,000 of Americans, oncologists and caregivers in this country, so he provides that expertise of the actual delivery to patients of the promises that we've heard through these sessions. So as a brief introduction, we heard about cardiovascular disease in the first session, and it is still the #1 cause of disease in the world. But if you ask people throughout the world, as the World Health Organization has done, what they most fear for themselves and their family as a diagnosis, it's cancer. And it's the second leading cause of death now in all markets of the world. When a patient gets cancer, they want it eradicated. That's their desire. And so we've always focused on those kind of issues. And the only experience we have in the caregiver and pharmaceutical community about eradication of disease are infectious diseases. So that was covered in terms of what the extraordinary accomplishments that were sort of glossed over as we went into the panel this morning on infectious diseases as we see this emerging resistance. And we probably need to take some lessons from that infectious disease community. And that's the only time we have in human disease where true eradication of what caused the disease is actually was successfully accomplished. And we can think of all the different ways in which that was accomplished and different mechanisms for the broad variety of microorganisms that invade our bodies and can cause disease. And so we need to learn from those lessons, and we'll address some of the issues of how that occurs with cancer within the panel. Finally, I think it's really important to understand that cancer is not one disease. You've heard in the last two panels about this idea of cancer. Cancer, we now know, is not one disease. We knew that from pathologists over the last 120 years. Based on pathologic descriptions of cancer, you can categorize cancer as 400 separate diseases now, each with their own pathogenesis, each of its own natural history, and each with its own unique form of treatment that has evolved as we've begun to understand that disease. But as you heard from the preceding two panels, we're in the process of a genomic revolution. And cancer has been influenced the most by that, because we don't need to understand all of the information you inherited from mom and dad to understand a patient's cancer. We need only to know the changes that have occurred in the cancer relative to the genes we inherited from mom and dad. And those within those set of changes are the drivers of what causes the cancer cell to go rogue, accumulate, metastasize, and do all the properties that we know of as cancer is harmful. So it's the place where precision medicine is most effectively practiced, and we'll talk about those kinds of issues going forward. But if you take it to the one last extension that I wanted to introduce before we turn to the panel for some questions, we've done enough sequencing of cancer patients throughout the world now. And what we have learned is it's not just 400 disease. Every patient is their own unique cancer. There are no two patients that are alike. When the Dana-Farber Cancer Center sequenced their lung cancer patients, the most common cancer throughout the world that causes death, they found they couldn't find a single patient with the same constellation of mutations in their first 300 patients. And so that means we're going to really have to think about how to attack this disease with either more generalized or more personalized therapies, and you may have to consider that at both of the extremes. So we want to cover all of those aspects and make this practical. This is not a theoretical discussion. We are represented here by the broader biotech and pharma community and by people that want to bring new innovations into the healthcare spaces we've heard about. And so we're going to focus ourselves on answering a set of questions for you, and then we're going to hopefully leave at least half of the time we have, because I was just told by Roy we can't go over your lunch break, to actually questions for the audience so that we can really focus on what the burning questions are going forward. I'm going to start with David on the left, because he's really overseen one of the major efforts in developing more precision to cancer therapeutics. And to ask the question, David, given the promise of precision therapies that we've just heard about, what's the future for traditional approaches of chemotherapy and other therapies, radiation, surgery as we go forward, that don't actually discriminate between normal and healthy tissues? How are we going to think about those kinds of drugs? If we look out at the drugs that have been approved that are most widely used, several of them that have been approved in the last few years don't attack cancer-specific mutations, but are having profound effects on patient care. And a number of drugs come to mind. The latest generation of the androgen inhibitors, the drugs such as abiraterone and enzalutamide that are having such effect. The more nonspecific immunologic therapies like ibrutinib and the PARP inhibitors that we're hearing so much about. So, David, I want to turn you over first and then ask each of the panelists to comment on that question of how are we going to mix and match traditional cytotoxic approaches with these new precision medicine?
Yes, I think one thing is clear. Much of the survival benefits we've seen in a variety of cancers over the last several decades have been exactly from those classes of drugs you mentioned, hormonal therapies, traditional chemotherapies, the tyrosine kinase inhibitors, and the like. And it's pretty clear from your also earlier statement that no one cancer is alike, no one patient's cancer is alike, that as cancers develop, even within an individual patient, they continue to generate new mutations. We are not likely to get to the point where we can address each of those in a highly targeted way anytime soon. And so those traditional therapies will play a big role. And certainly in places like breast cancer, I'm sure Cliff is a much greater expert than I am, prostate cancer and the like, the hormonal therapies have really changed the world in a remarkable way. So whether it's going to be in conditioning regimens, whether it's going to be in combination with immune-acting drugs, combinations of still chemotherapies and TKIs, I think there's still a lot of research to be done. There's still advances to be made. Part of the challenge will be the flow of funds, where the financing is going to come for those additional discoveries, because there is so much excitement now over our ability now to start to manipulate the immune system, that almost all the money is going there, if you look at the venture capital industry, for example. So it's going to leave some of the more traditional approaches with less competition, which is good, but scientists that have good ideas may not find the funding as easy as they would have found in the past. But I'm quite sure that when we get back together in a few more years, there will be still additional breakthroughs in let's call them less targeted or less precise ways. So with that, I think we should turn it over to the rest of the panel to see what they think.
Either of you want to comment on that?
Well, I guess I was invited to. You know, endocrine therapy is an interesting example in the history of cancer care, but specifically breast cancer. Were we to discover the ER this year and find a drug like tamoxifen, it would be hailed as the largest breakthrough, I think, in the treatment of cancer. And it bears repeating that from that broadest class of drugs, I mean ovarian suppression, SERMs, and more recently SERDs and aromatase inhibitors, what you have fundamentally is a relatively non-toxic, now inexpensive, modestly targeted therapy. And what I mean by that is, yes, we find one target, ER, but the truth of the matter is that the same heterogeneity that we were just describing exists there in the cohort that you call ER positive. What every clinician has in their practice is somebody on first or second line endocrine therapy for decades for metastatic disease. And that is the exact same breakthrough that was described for lung cancer as eye-opening with the TKIs, except we've been seeing it for decades or longer in breast cancer. And so all I would say is there will continue to be an important role for those traditional relatively less targeted therapies, and I'll add the little pride that they come at extraordinarily low cost, both financially and toxicity-wise. As soon as we add any virtually of the new targeted therapies to them, we dramatically change that equation in two ways, and it's a really important issue that we will have to grapple with.
And maybe just to build a little bit on both of the comments made, I think it's a reminder that we need to be looking at the big picture as well as following where the breakthroughs in science are and where the next shiny new thing is. We do need to take, sort of a broad perspective and a lifespan approach. We need to continue to understand more about the appropriate use of therapies that exist, learning more about both how best to use them, including deeper insights into off-label uses for some of the drugs that are currently in practice. We also need to continue to work on adherence and appropriate use by both healthcare providers and making sure patients and their families and caregivers understand about how to get maximal benefit from these drugs. Then we need to make sure that we're continuing to advance the new therapies, hopefully building on knowledge gained from existing therapies and approaches, but also new breakthroughs in science. And there, I think, is probably where the greatest interest in this group is, and I think, the promise is clearly enormous. But one additional thought is the importance of really working together across disciplines, across sectors, bringing the regulator in early, as was discussed before, and thinking about these problems on a global basis.
So, Peggy, that's an important point, and we're into a political season right now, so we're hearing a lot about cancer in the political realm, because cancer can be a fatal diagnosis. Patient advocacy groups are very strong in the various diseases of cancer, and obviously that impinges on all of us in this room, but in particularly on the regulatory agencies. And so how do we separate out the political issues from the broader issues of delivering hope to patients and their families?
Well, I'll go first on that one. And I think really important issues, and obviously this is an important time to be thinking about the intersection of politics and the pursuit of science. And I guess I would say it really is an important time in our country, but in other parts of the world, to make sure that we are supporting an environment where we can really take best advantage of the advances in science and technology today. And I think there's some warning signs on the horizon. For one thing, as we look at the election campaign in this country, it's been striking how little discussion there has been on matters that really have to do with science, and particularly, from my perspective, talking about the critical role that advancing science and innovation for health means for the future of this country, in terms of obviously the health of individuals and families and communities, but also the health of our healthcare system, and how can we make sure that we have the right medical tools and they're being used correctly, so that we can reduce preventable healthcare costs and apply resources in the ways that have most value. But then also thinking about what is innovation in this area of biomedical product development mean for our economy, for high-value jobs, for global commerce, et cetera. And these aren't issues unique to our country, but I'm looking at it from the perspective of someone that recently was running a major U.S.-based government agency, and worrying about what the world may look like just a few weeks from now once a new president is elected. Another trend that I think is very worrisome, and we all really, I think, need to address, is the fact that we are now living in an environment where evidence just doesn't seem to matter as much, and where we're seeing people asserting their opinions in place of science, and I think we all need to really care about that. And I think it's not just true in this country. I think, if you looked at the Brexit issue, I just came back from London last evening, there was a great deal of concern that expertise just didn't matter in the discussions. In fact, it was almost a negative and almost discounted. So I think, we need to be thinking about that. And the fact that this is coupled, I think, with some skepticism of science, and particularly as appropriate attention is being given to issues around research reproducibility and other related topics, that we not confound this growing sort of science denialism and discounting of experts with what needs to be done to advance research. And of course the nationalism worries me a bit as well, since science is inherently a global enterprise, and we really need to make sure that there are full opportunities to collaborate around the world. And in that spirit of partnership also, I think we need to recognize that part of what's needed to address some of the concerns before us is more openness and transparency as we collaborate in more true partnership. Just one last thing on the subject of the regulator. Some of this environment, I think, could have particularly negative consequences for regulatory agencies. This is a moment where the rhetoric that's anti-government is strong, blow up systems rather than make them better. And for FDA and other regulatory authorities around the world, I think and for industry and patients, academic research and others, it's really important to recognize the role the regulator can play in supporting the advance of good science, the rigor that's needed to make products better, safer, and really deliver value. And, I think we're starting to see some calls to strip away standards, to move products out, and let the marketplace figure out if they work or not. That's at odds with the pressures on value and reimbursement. But I think we all need to look at it, because at the end of the day, I think we're all in it together. Several people in previous panels talked about the importance of early and ongoing engagement of the regulator to shape the R&D agenda, as well as obviously the importance of streamlining and modernizing the regulatory pathways. But I do think this is a critical time, and we should be watching the big picture politics as well as addressing how do we deliver on the promise of science today.
Anything to add to that, Cliff?
Well, I would just say that this is really an opportunity. And for the last few years, I have been troubled, as you've described, by the seeming schism between much of the lay public and the scientific community. And there have even been some editorials and comments by leaders in our world basically turning their back on the attempt to teach the public, giving up on that idea of communication. What we have in cancer medicine is a unique opportunity to bridge that gap that we should be seizing, because, as Craig pointed out, when a patient and a family first deals with cancer, in some cases, in many cases, it's their first brush against real science and evidence-based decision-making. Doctors are weighing challenging distinctions that are modest between options, and they're teaching the patients why they choose what they do. Of course, not in all cases, but the chance, the opportunity is there. And so as we go to the Hill, and you know, in your role, I don't think you could lobby, but we lobby for you. One of the things that we would frequently do, and I do it all the time, is point out to, in a bipartisan way, that one of the ways in which America is a leading nation isn't just its military might, but it's in fact the unprecedented decades-long investment in science and technology, broadly described, which has allowed us both to lead the world but also build wealth within the country, and you touched on that. And I think that simple story, that the investment that we make in science and technology pays acute dividends economically and long-term benefits for the health of the populace and longer-term geopolitical benefits in dominance. Those are stories that do resonate. And I'll just end by saying, in an optimistic way, at least in terms of science and technology and health, the last few months on the Hill, there's been a little more of a bipartisan feeling of support, I think, around issues like the moonshot and the cures bill and so forth. So I am not cynical. You have to go past the cynicism, and we all collectively have to be able to tell a fairly simple story like I just tried to. You'll have a lot of losses, and in the short term, it'll have no payoff. But in the long term, I actually think it is possible to move this enterprise.
So, David, as the pharmaceutical representative on this panel, given what Peggy and Cliff have just said, when you're developing drugs, as Cliff just said, patients are willing to take on any risk to have an opportunity. And so their patient advocate groups are right with the in the faces of the regulators and with the drug companies, develop it as quickly as I can, give it to me as compassionate use. But the minute a drug's approved, the first side effect, and we see what the backlash is going forward. How does the pharmaceutical companies weigh that benefit and risk? There are no therapies that are going to be without safety concerns. We just heard about two exciting advances in terms of both checkpoint blockade, which has significant immunologic side effects, and now the CAR T cells, where we heard just recently of 2 deaths that stopped the first phase 1 trial, at least briefly, until the regulators came in and approved the reopening with some revisions. So how do you weigh it, or how does any pharmaceutical company think about that, weigh that as they develop the drugs?
Well, first of all, the pharma industry actually appreciates a strong regulatory framework for lots of reasons. For nothing else, it sets a reasonable bar for bringing a new therapy forward. And when you flood the market, or potentially would flood the market with agents that are not well characterized and tested, we're going to have a lot more of those stories of people being harmed. It's also going to be increasingly difficult for clinicians as well as patients to figure out what likely works and what doesn't work. If the bar is too high, of course, then you have the opposite problem, where people are waiting and they can't wait forever because time really matters, and they can't get their therapies. And I very much appreciated, when I was working in oncology at Novartis, how far Richard Pazder had really brought us to a better place where decisions were being made more quickly, but yet there was a framework that we could all count on and a basic standard before a drug would be approved, whether it be for the primary indication or secondary indications. I think you touch on something that's related. I'd like to spend a minute on just the risk of being controversial. And since I'm not employed, I can be more controversial than I used to be. Patients in this country are really upset. They're pissed. And they're pissed for lots of reasons. They may not be able to get access to their medicines. They're pissed about the pricing of medicines in particular because it's gotten a lot of publicity because there's some bad actors in the pharmaceutical industry, but also because the politicians have seen an opportunity to be aligned with those upset patients, to fan the flames, so to speak, and to gain votes by threatening to do terrible things to a variety of industries, but the pharma industry is usually the sitting duck that tends to get the worst of it.
And the FDA.
Good point. We're in this. We're in this together.
As long as it's not the doctors.
And I do agree with the earlier comment that the U.S. drives a disproportionately large share of the scientific breakthroughs in the world, and it's in part because of all the great funding that's been made through NIH and through other institutions, the venture capital industry, et cetera, in the U.S. But what people don't realize, what most Americans don't realize, and some of you may disagree, but I lived it over the last 2 years where I saw it firsthand at my previous company, access to new medicines, I'm not talking about the older drugs, access to new medicines is actually better in Europe than it is in the United States now. And people do not recognize that. And it's a combination of copays, of prior authorizations where physicians cannot prescribe what they want to prescribe in this country without getting somebody else, an insurer or PBM or somebody, to approve it. And while prices are lower in Europe, admittedly, in some cases much lower, access is generally open. There are no copays. There are not blocks in place. And actually, Europe is becoming a more attractive, on a relative basis, a more attractive pharmaceutical market. When I started, the pharmaceutical industry, you were successful as a company if you did well in the U.S. and everything else was secondary. It is starting completely to flip, and people are not getting drugs in this country. So we're spending all the money on breakthroughs. Some of the best companies in the world are located in the U.S., and yet at the end of the day, patients struggle with their insurers to get their medicines covered. I sat on another panel recently, actually, it was in Alexandria, in fact. Sitting next to me was I think a chief medical officer from a PBM, and I was sitting right next to him, and at the end of the conference we shook hands. I didn't strangle him, although there was a moment when I felt like I should. And they were complaining about the prices of drugs, which are admittedly higher, although when you start looking at net prices, the gap is not quite as big as you think because of all the rebates that are going to the PBMs. And I asked the following question. I turned to this person and I said, if the pharma industry could somehow get together, and it may not even be legal, but somehow could get together and cut all their prices 10%, would you reduce copays? He said, no, we get bigger rebates on that. So what if the pharmaceutical industry could cut prices 20%? Would you reduce the copays and out-of-pocket? He says, no, we can do better than that. I said, well, what if it was 30%? And then the whole audience started to laugh because the reality is, while pricing is an issue, it's much more what's going on in the world to restrict access. And I, for one, who have had the opportunity to work on some really terrific breakthrough medicines, including Gleevec, where this great institution gave us an award, I think it was back in 2006 or so. It's really, really sad. Thank you. It's really sad and painful for the scientists working in the pharmaceutical industry and all the great investigators that we work together with and the regulators who bust their butts to get these drugs approved, then find out patients can't actually get the drug. And I think this is a big, big issue, and it would be nice if we could have a discourse on that, but you're right, the political environment does not allow it right now.
So just to follow up on that, David, and we will get to other questions a little out of order what we'd planned, drug pricing is what is on everyone's mind, and particularly is something that in this country the patients are focusing on. You've addressed many of the larger business reasons, but how should we focus on the value of a drug going forward? How are we going to get to a rational point that gets people behind what the innovation that's brought in by the biotech and the pharma industry? So I wanted all the panelists' opinions on whether or not pricing should be different. In cancer, we've got new drugs that get approved because they prolong the median survival for patients, but ultimately don't arrest the steady progression of the disease. They just slow it. There are others that make it, like Gleevec, the example you had, which turned a fatal disease into a chronic illness for a huge number of patients that had this individual cancer. And then finally, as we heard in the earlier panel, some of the immunotherapy are big upfront costs, but they actually put patients into a cancer-free state in which they may have a higher risk of getting a secondary cancer, but the cancer that they were found is actually eliminated, but the cost has to be all up front and immediate. How are we going to think about that going forward? What are the perspectives of each of the three communities? Maybe, Peggy, you didn't have to answer or shouldn't have answered in your prior capacity.
No,
Tell me about it now.
In my last life, it was much easier because I just said that FDA was statutorily prohibited from discussing the cost issues. I mean, it's obviously a huge issue, and I think it's really a hard one to even begin to sort of penetrate in terms of all of the different issues, because it's such an opaque system in this country, at least, in terms of what are the real costs, starting from the question of what are the genuine R&D investments and the broader landscape in terms of the development costs that ultimately go into price.
When you reach out as foreign secretary and talk to it's David's point, the European countries can, at a larger national level, make some of those decisions and seem to be. Is there a path forward to be learned in that way?
Well, it's interesting because there's only one regulator that actually sets cost, I think, which is the Italian regulator. But in many countries, there is the close working relationship of an HTA, a Health Technology Assessment entity like NICE in the UK, and the regulator and the broader development community in terms of thinking through and trying to assess, not just safety and efficacy and quality and performance of a drug, but actually the cost effectiveness of a product and trying to get at that value question. And I think, all over the world, people are struggling with how do you do that kind of assessment, and how do you do it in terms of what's good for an individual patient, which may be quite different than what's good for a population of patients, and what's good for a national bank account as well. But I guess, for me, there are a couple of issues that we really have to drill down on. One is that I do believe, and maybe I'm still too much of a Pollyanna after all this time, that we're at a point where we can develop better drugs more efficiently because the science is better, and in some instances it will be more upfront costs for the ultimate benefits. But I think, we can really see some of the development efforts actually become more efficient when they're built on strong science, and we really know what we're trying to develop for which patients, how, and why. And also, I think we need to learn more from failure, and that leads to more transparency and data sharing as well, so we don't go down the same path again and again only to fail. I do think we've got to, speaking of transparency, really open up and understand, your PBM friend and what they do, and all of we have such a complicated system before, once the drug is coming off the manufacturing line and when the bill is paid, and I think it's really hard to know. Part of that, maybe I can ask my colleague on the panel, is I also am a little bit mystified by how much the U.S. population is in some ways cross-subsidizing cheaper drug costs in Europe and other places in the world as well, and how, looking across borders, we need to rationalize systems some. But I don't have any answers, but I think, we absolutely have to address this. And again, coming back to the political environment, I'm a little bit worried that the current climate is not going to lead to the thoughtful, careful discussion and analysis that's needed as we look at what is a complicated ecosystem, but instead there's going to be a lot of inflamed rhetoric, finger-pointing, and efforts to show we're doing something that actually may not fix the problem and may have significant unintended consequences.
And Cliff, when it gets down to the patient and their doctor, how are these decisions playing out?
Well, let me start by saying something that maybe is simple and obvious, but I think we can't begin to solve this problem unless we understand the components. And let me put a couple of hypotheses out there. We have no healthcare system in the U.S. We have no shared vision for what healthcare is. We have no agreement about what is a right, what is a privilege. And these may seem very lofty, but the truth is, with all of the compromises that follow, lots of other societies around the world have at least a shared vision. You were in the UK yesterday. They may despise some aspects of the NHS, but to a certain degree, the country's culture is built around the idea that everybody has access to care, and then it fails. I understand. But the vision is that. But it's even a little worse here because we don't have that vision in any way here. So we have a fundamental, basic societal issue unresolved, and then every single product and discussion is a proxy war for these big unresolved issues. And I actually, this is where I am a pessimist. I don't think we have much of a chance of resolving this until we deal with the big issues. And the consequence of that is, if you think about the discussion the last couple of minutes, we're actually doing Econ 101 from scratch without talking about the basics of economics. Who's the customer? What's their bid? What's your counter offer? What do they call a valuable endpoint? How much do they know to make that bid? So we all have surrogates and agents doing this buying for us, obviously. And I can go on and on and on because this is all a way of avoiding any useful suggestions, I understand. And I don't have them. At the patient interface, it's a real problem. In the last couple of years, there have been a number of attempts to try to inform a discussion between doctors and patients, or payers and industry and regulators, from Memorial's Peter Bach's Drug Abacus to NICE to ICER to the ASCO Value Framework. And as the supporter of one of those, I have to tell you I'm very frustrated by its limits and inability to really get at the issue. To your point, Craig, when you're sitting in a room with a patient who has metastatic non-small cell, and you start to talk about any aspect of whether it's $2 or $5 or $20,000 more per month for a 5 or 10 or 30% chance of being alive at some, abstract time in the future, it breaks down emotionally, and it has the risk of pitting, even if it's not true, of seeming to pit physicians' interests against the patients. So I'll go one step further. I think it's a little unfair to put ultimately the clinician community in the position of adjudicating that. And so one way or another, we're going to have unintended and unfortunate consequences. When it's all said and done, my fear is that it'll be a regulatory solution because of the political climate that you've all described. And that's probably the only thing that will make all this just a little bit worse. And on top of that, ultimately, what we're dependent on, indeed, is the attractiveness of investment and the free flow of capital into this space so that we can innovate. The challenge to all of us is to ask a simple question, which is, what is it that has prevented drug and treatment development from following the paradigm of the rest of technology, where there are significant technical advances coupled by fall in price?
So I think you've heard universally from the panel that one way forward in cancer, that I think we believe collectively, is the innovations in science, which you've heard about through all the last 3 sessions today, have been stunning, and they're most directly applied to cancer, and our new appreciations of how to harness the immune system, our new targeted therapeutics against specific cancer-specific mutations, and our understanding of precision diagnostics to pick which patients should get which of the traditional chemotherapeutic agents. But as we've heard over the course of the day, there are over 1,000 drugs in development right now for cancer. And we've heard from the panel earlier today what was the ultimate success in the community that takes care of infectious diseases was combinations of drugs. And I think more and more we're seeing the same thing play out in first-line therapy in cancers. The most effective are combination. It's not possible, given the way we do current clinical trials, for every combination of 2, 3, or 4 drugs to play out in the population that exists in the world at any one time. So, Cliff, you've been a leading advocate of clinical trials and leader of clinical trials. How do we start to address these problems, or how do we get ahead of the numbers game for patients and more rapidly develop new frontline therapies?
Yeah, so here I can talk about some practical solutions that are underway already. Only 3%, 4%, maybe up to 20 at leading cancer centers of adults with solid tumors enroll in a clinical trial right now. That means that we're losing the ability to learn and make progress from the vast majority of people who are having an experience treating. The rest of the digital economy doesn't operate that way. Every mouse click, every page you view, everywhere you go on the web is at least tracked. And while causation scientifically can't be generated from that, meaningful, robust associations are. And so you heard in the last session the beginning of some discussions about taking our siloed electronic health record systems and beginning to learn from those everyday interactions. To your point, Craig, there are a whole bunch of quick things to think about. First of all, we need shared agreement on what endpoints really matter. Second of all, we need EMR systems that actually capture and structure data fields, useful data. Third, we need systems to extract that and standardize it. The ASCO effort, which is a nonprofit one, is CancerLink. It's one of these multiple big data projects. It has more than 1 million charts in it now from individual patients, and it is going to be, I think, a useful additional resource, and it'll provide us all with an opportunity to learn and learn faster. To the specific question, right now, because of the entry of a new player in the last decade and a half, from the FDA point of view, I've had this conversation with Rick about approvals multiple times. The agency doesn't really regulate how we practice cancer medicine. The agency approves drugs based on safety and efficacy and then trusts the community to learn how to use them correctly over time. It's the payers that are regulating that latter part now, and in a sense, they're outside of the regulatory framework. So how do we learn off target, as you just described? How do we learn about combinations? The only way to do it is to either do the impossible, which is write almost an infinite number of studies, or reimagine the clinical trials structure. For example, if you had off-label use of approved drugs and you actually saw what happened in each patient and the data was adequate to the question, is there a response, how durable is it, are there unexpected toxicities, you should be able to get that out of routine clinical care. You should be able to get that out of any competent oncologist without special training. So I am actually very optimistic that we will be able to enable freer, earlier approval of drugs because of the promised delivery of real-world evidence that is useful for purpose and will allow us to learn what we can recommend both for and against. And we have begun this. There is a trial that Rich Shilsky, the Chief Medical Officer at ASCO, launched in the last 12 months. It's really a counter to all of the concerns everybody has about clinical research. It has, I think, 17 drugs from 8 or so manufacturers. They're all approved. They're all given, in this case, off-label based on routine genomic testing done in multiple standard clinical labs. And essentially, it's a way to kill these drugs and target combinations fast or find the ones that work. And the eligibility criteria are stripped down and consistent with the ASCO AACI proposal from a couple of months back. You know, for example, eligibility is age 12, not 18. Brain metastases are allowed. All the things that are bugaboos in routine clinical research are stripped out. The data collection is minimal. It's based on the EMR. And so that's where combinations can get tested, Craig, because once we see an indication for them, we can assemble that cohort of 12 or 18. I do want to end, though, with one science point. It isn't even enough to talk about a combination because, as you know, the scheduling and timing of the agents in the combination are a massive challenge to consider. And for that, I defer to somebody with greater expertise.
So before I turn it over to the rest of the panel, David or Peggy, anything to add to that?
Just on the combo side, I actually very much like the study you mentioned, and there's been several other variations of that idea because we have to quickly get through the potential combinations, at least identify with good hypotheses other than just an understanding of cellular communication, which ones we want to do more robust clinical trials for. So I think that's very helpful. And I think it's only through that mechanism that we're going to get the answers, in part because drug companies often don't have all the different products in their own portfolios, and the combinations are clearly going to go across different companies' portfolios. Having said that, I do think you'll see more and more pharma companies working together and acquiring each other so they can get the breadth of the package. both to answer the scientific question, but also back to the pricing question, you can begin to imagine if these combos work better, which we all hope they will, and they likely will, and patients live longer. There's no way society can afford to give someone three medicines for $150,000 each if they're going to now live 20 years. I mean, it's just the numbers become astronomical. And to the extent that you have the different mechanisms in one company's portfolio, there's an opportunity to make a different offering to the payers and basically say, I'm making this up on the spot, we'll treat all breast cancer patients with the following genetic type, and the price is X, and you get all the medicines that you need. Because I think we're going to have to eventually get there. Otherwise, the system will just collapse on its own weight.
And just to quickly add to this discussion, I mean, I think that, you know, putting on my regulator hat again, FDA certainly was appreciative of the fact that in many domains, the need to really address how to study combinations of drugs was critical, and guidance was put out. It was, as you noted, more in the context of infectious disease threats, but recognizing the importance in other arenas as well. But it's challenging, and it's yet one of the examples where for FDA to do its job in a way that's actually going to be meaningful and helpful to the scientific community and to research and development efforts, there has to be a sort of a coming together to identify what is the challenge and how can we bring the best possible science to bear on how to address it and how FDA defines its role. And I think FDA is much more open to that than sometimes people realize. I also think that the reality is it's not just a bunch of different drugs, but it also crosses therapeutics and diagnostics and other devices. And, of course, our regulatory system, in terms of the history of its development and the legal regulatory framework, is siloed. But also much of the research community is siloed as well in this way. And we really need to think in a more comprehensive way. FDA, as I'm sure many of you know, recently made the decision to try to create a center of excellence in the oncology area that will bring together, under the vision and leadership of Rick Pazder, those components of FDA to try to do a better job. But I think, again, what happens at FDA has to be reflected in some of the research and development activities. And I think we're seeing a huge amount of innovation in how clinical trials are done, and that's very exciting, and I think making a difference already in terms of how they're structured and undertaken, and how we are moving also towards real-world evidence and pushing some of the clinical trial activity closer to where the patients actually are.
Great. Well, at this point, I want to turn it on to the audience for any questions. We have one here.
Thank you. Jay Siegel, Johnson & Johnson. So there's no question, as we've heard over the course of the day, that scientific advances have advanced the treatment of science, and technology advances have advanced the treatment of science, and regulatory science advances have advanced the treatment of oncology, of cancer, I mean. But I would argue that there's been another component, and that is, in fact, the reimbursement and drug pricing situation. As Jonathan Leff said in an earlier panel, VC invests where they think they have a chance to realize profit. And so does the pharmaceutical industry, I can assure you. And at the end of the day, one of the components in that calculation is what the sales will look at like if you're successful. And in cancer, perhaps in part because, like other rare diseases, the populations are relatively small, perhaps because of patient activism, whether even in UK and in the US, there's been more resistance to types of price controls that now everybody is talking about. So there is I certainly believe that some of while recognizing that there are abuses in pricing, that there's untenable situations in terms of costs, one can predict, especially with some of the less thoughtful proposals, that innovation, that the 400 drugs, that the great scientific advances will never translate if we have pricing mechanisms that are anti-innovative. And so my question is that connection adequately understood in the communities you work in and adequately communicated to policymakers and lawmakers who are under, in many cases, quite appropriately, tremendous pressure to do something about costs of drugs?
So everything you said is accurate. And I go back to a comment I made earlier. People are pissed, and it's an election cycle. So they're just not listening. And I think if you talk to different congressmen, for example, many understand, not all, but many understand, but they're saying, sorry, I have to do something, I have to vote for something, and we're going to all pay the price for that. And so be it. There may be a little less money that goes into venture capital, or pharma companies may have to restrict some of their R&D spending because they're going to be under pricing pressure. The question is, will we do something that's so harmful that it's not reversible, do something really draconian, and that would be really sad for everybody? Or is the industry going to have to give a little bit in order for to calm it down? And then maybe one day when the political scene is more rational, maybe the next election, there'll be a better conversation like Cliff and Peggy were talking about, and we can actually do something that's smart. So the fear is that we go overboard. I think if there's some actions that are taken that end up with dampening of prices a little bit, and maybe at the same time even co-pays come down so people can get the drug, it won't be the end of the world. But clearly there is, to your point, a direct connection by the amount of money that flows into either R&D or venture capital based upon the thought of future profits from these medicines. So I agree with you, but it's not going to happen soon. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah,
Yep.
Ramsey Dagger from Pfizer. We started a little bit about the government funding, then moved, understandably, a lot of time to the pricing and the overall societal issues. I want to go back a little bit to the topic of governmental involvement in, not just monetary and other incentives in for research in science and the science of health, and not just from a U.S. perspective, but if you look at it globally or internationally, is it that globally there's less involvement of governments in this space, or is it simply that there's a shift in the geographic weight from the U.S. to other, regions? How you comment on that, or how you see that in the next, 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I don't know if you can answer. I don't know the shift question, but if you go historically in the post-World War II period, on a per capita, per GDP basis, essentially the U.S. has been by far the most massive investor in science, and specifically medical science. There are a few countries that have invested proportionally to their GDP, but they're much smaller economies. And so I don't think there's anybody that challenges the leadership of the U.S. in this investment space. I may be wrong. Maybe someone can identify another economy that comes close. But from a federal funding point of view, I don't think there's anybody close. There's nothing like the NCI anywhere else, or, for that matter, NIH.
I do think that we need to recognize that we're not in a great place in this country in terms of support for research, that the history of funding has been great, and I think the products of those investments have really made a difference. But we have seen, real-world declines in the funding of NIH and other science institutions. And, I think that despite all of the initiatives that have gotten a lot of attention, precision medicine, cancer moonshot, et cetera, they're not always followed by the actual money that's hoped for, and we need to look at that. And you can see, I think, I haven't tracked this area really carefully, but we are seeing increases in private R&D contributions and philanthropic, but it's not filling the gap. So I think, we do need to be very mindful about that and pay attention. I think we also need to think about, what's the best balance of the public dollars and the private and philanthropic dollars, so that we actually have an ecosystem that doesn't have huge gaps and that enables, the full transfer from discovery through to real-world products. I think it is interesting to look at some other countries. I just came back a few weeks ago from a visit to China, and that's a country that is investing in biomedical product innovation, in part because they care about the health of their citizens, but also because they see it as a huge driver of their economy. And I think that, they're not unique in terms of, really looking at the landscape and saying this is a critical area, both in terms of the opportunities that advances in science and technology can offer, but also the chance to put it into an economic engine that will make a difference for their national economies.
If I could just add on that, it's not just the money that will go into science, for example, NIH. It's more, I would describe as a total ecosystem, and where the U.S. has been significantly advantaged historically in some countries, and I would have mentioned China as the example, are trying to take a page out of our book and actually take it a step further. So, for example, what we do here is pretty high risk compared to other industries. So the ability to start up companies quickly and close down companies where there's a failure quickly is very important. Europeans have been significantly disadvantaged because it becomes almost impossible to fire somebody once you've started a company. And even getting the company started could take 2 or 3 years when, there can be a venture capitalist in Boston or here in New York, and you can start a company the next day pretty much if you want to. I'm exaggerating, but you get the idea. In addition, the risk is that and the U.S. is not as good as it was, but still better than many places, is that there'll be other over-regulation that will prevent good science from taking a next step. So all the discussions about stem cells and other controversial topics that may put a damper on your ability to exploit the scientific finding can make other countries more attractive. And as far as I can tell from the Chinese, there are almost no rules, so they really can go fast. And some of the best scientists in the world who may have been born in China then were educated in Europe and the U.S. are now moving back. In fact, my previous company built a huge discovery center outside Shanghai. There's almost 1,000 people working there because it is easy to get things moving and going. And then last but not least, there are countries, and the one that really stands out, I lived there for 6.5 years, is Switzerland. While a very small country, and certainly in terms of the money the government spends, it's almost nothing. But they've made for an extraordinarily attractive environment from a tax and other perspective that big pharma companies can really thrive there. And some of the biggest companies in the world are based in a very tiny country because the government understands that it's good for them to make those companies flourish.
Any further questions? One last question before we close for lunch.
My name is Mark Rodman. In my old life, I started a clinical laboratory called BioReference that grew to the 3rd largest lab in the country. And part of us, GeneDx, did a great number of probably more widespread sequencing, both of tumors, both germline and somatic, of any laboratory in the world. And in my other role, as Dr. Hamburg may not remember, we were on the other side of a table as head of the Clinical Laboratory Association, where we argued or we discussed the role of laboratory-developed procedures, because virtually every sequencing we do right now is not regulated, is a laboratory-developed procedure, and not necessarily with FDA proposal. I don't want to talk about that.
Good.
What I do want to say is that we are talking about reimbursements, and that the burden and the obstacles to develop new therapeutics are effective clinical trials and reimbursement challenges. So one of the things that I do want to bring up, regardless of any regulatory oversight, is the fact that simply because of lack of reimbursement today, sequencing is really not reimbursed reasonably. This goes to children who have intellectual disabilities getting exomes as well as tumor samples. Part of it is the industry who charge too much, but part of it is a system where they simply are not reimbursed. And as you mentioned, Dr. Hudis, that when you talk about clinical trials, there will be an X% of people who will go in and go into them, but when given the result of a test saying that this new therapy is designed for something that's them, you'll double the recruitment. So you can't unlink the diagnostic and the therapeutic. And how do we go in and approach ways to get more people tested and characterized and available for clinical trials? Because we can't fix reimbursement for diagnostics. We're not going to fix reimbursements for therapeutics.
Well, I'll speak as the CEO of one of the largest cancer hospitals in America. I completely agree with you. We've heard about the great molecular discoveries that are fueling this innovation in cancer. Right now, we sequence every patient who needs a therapeutic decision at Memorial Sloan-Kettering with our own test. We've gotten Wadsworth to approve it in New York, so it is a CLIA-approved regulatory. We can make clinical decisions based on that. We spend $22 million of our own money just on the operational aspects of doing the sequencing and delivering the sequence to our EMR, and so that the doctors can make clinical decisions to enroll in clinical trials that we make available to the pharmaceutical industry, as well as to make best care decisions for the 40 level 1 diagnostic markers in cancer that have already been established in various ways by the compendium. That costs us $22 million that nobody reimburses us for. And it is going to be the single weight that drives the caregivers into bankruptcy. It's why 85% of cancer that's delivered by community oncologists just doesn't have that available right now. And so somehow we are going to have to step up. We have spent a lot of time with the Moonshot Initiative as a single organization, that is Memorial Sloan-Kettering, pointing out that the single best thing that the government could actually do is approve the reimbursement appropriate for people that have therapeutic decisions. It can be at a real cost point, but in fact, at the way it's going right now, even with all of our resources, we'll run out of the capacity to do that in the next 5 to 7 years. We just won't be able to provide that service anymore as the margins get for doing clinical care go on. So I completely echo in your statements. We have this opportunity to double down on all the science in cancer, and yet the most fundamental aspect of that, which is understanding into the best detail a patient's cancer. And I'm not talking to everyone for whole genome sequence, just to know the genes that we would be able to have actionable decisions, have clinical trials on. We can't get that reimbursed as a caregiver community. So it's a challenge for all of us that sit on the drug discovery, because we can't find the patients and demonstrate them better. We're not going to get to the next level of care. And I think cancer is the battle point for where we're going to see precision and genomic medicine come into place. So I hope we all work towards that end point. I'm going to take the chairman's prerogative and bring it to a close at this point. I really thank everyone for a very important discussion, and I look forward to the continuing today. Thank you to all the panelists.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it was great. You guys were terrific, all three of you.